Welcome, everyone. Usually someone else is hosting these events. Some of you might have expected Shaya here, but sadly she can't make it today. And so I told her I can step in, even though I just moved yesterday to Munich and it's been pretty stressful, but yeah. So I'm not sure who else got this before, who has done other master classes from AlphaList. There's a certain flow we have here. So today, Rebecca is going to talk to us about rethinking developer productivity. And I already talked to her yesterday, and I also listened to the podcast again that she did with Toby a week ago, something. I'm not sure when it was, when it first launched, like a week ago. But yeah, so the podcast was out. I do have a lot of questions. We didn't talk about all of them yesterday. But yeah, so that's that. Oh, I put another smiley, figuring out the online stuff. So Rebecca said that she is fine with doing either way of doing the Q&A session. So if you want to ask something directly during the presentation, you can just raise your hands down at the bottom. I'm not sure. I think everyone knows, but you can raise your hands and say, hey, I would like to ask a question. Or you could go, as it's very explicitly shown here, into the Q&A section in order to just submit a Q&A. And you can also up and down vote questions there in order for us to address them after Rebecca's sessions. So yeah, please ask questions. I think it's, as a speaker, it's always greatly appreciated if you get questions because it feels like people engage with your topic.
Paying attention.
And also, yeah, today's session from Rebecca, who is the field CTO of Swarmia, is also brought to you by Swarmia. But I think it's just in general, like I said, we had a great conversation about the developer productivity. What is developer productivity anyway? And what's the difference between efficiency, effectiveness? How do you measure that? And I think there's a lot of different models. I'm not sure, maybe a short test if okay. Maybe a short test if the whole Q&A session thing works. Who here listened to the podcast? Maybe you can raise your hands or give a thumbs up who listened to the podcast. Oh, there's people. Okay, there's a few raising hands. You can also give a thumbs up reaction. That's also fine. There's a few people raising their hands. Okay. So with that, so not waste any more time, we're exactly on time. Let's hand it over to Rebecca. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Rebecca, for coming. And I'm really looking forward to this.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Martin, for the intro and for coordinating things around here while Shaya is not available. Really great to see so many people here, and like Martin said, I'm the field CTO at Swarmia, and Swarmia is a tool, a platform that engineering leaders like yourself can use to understand how work is moving through your engineering organization, to identify and eliminate bottlenecks. And kind of understand how much time is going into which work, so that you can make sure that the work that you're doing and the way that you're investing your engineering time is well aligned with the business's goals and objectives. So happy to talk about Swarmia. I'm not going to talk about Swarmia very much during this presentation, but sometimes I forget to introduce it at all. So I wanted to make sure that I did that. This is me. Prior to joining Swarmia a couple of years ago, I was working on developer productivity at Stripe and then previously at Indeed. And just make sure you don't leave out the E if you're looking for me, because I don't know who you will find, but there's some guy in Australia who buys trailer parts and books golf course tee times using my email address. So if you ever hear from Robert Murphy, let me know. I've also got a podcast separate from the podcast that I record with Toby, Unblocked.fm, where we talk about just lived experiences of engineering leaders and the challenges that they've navigated and hopefully successfully tackled. So, but yeah, today I want to talk about productivity in general. And something that's been on my mind a lot is often the conversations about developer productivity or engineering effectiveness or developer, whatever we want to call it. We can talk about the difference between those things, but whatever we want to call it, often the focus is on the team or the individual and trying to make sure that the team or the individual is being as productive as possible and eliminating bottlenecks at that level. But what I want to talk about today is a little bit more about how you as leaders can make or not make decisions that directly contribute to the productivity of your team. We'll have lots of time to talk about if you have questions about measuring productivity and those sorts of things. But when I was thinking about what message I really wanted to convey to this audience, it's that you as leaders have a lot of not just responsibility to, not just the capability to kind of identify when things are going wrong at that lower level, but to actually make decisions, like I said, make decisions or not make decisions that can have a pretty global impact on productivity. So I wanted to start, and you can also use the chat here or raise your hand or whatever you would like. But I wanted to ask, like, what's your most expensive line of code? And when you think about that question, it could be, one line of code that took 6 months to write. It could be one line of code that has been fought over for years or something like that. But yeah, I just want to have you think for a minute. What is your most expensive line of code? I like one of the most expensive lines of code that I can think of was a error in a component library. Like a single line error in a component library that made a checkbox not behave like a checkbox when I was working at Indeed. And the users of that component library, we used the checkbox expecting it to work like a checkbox, and it didn't. And so we lost about $2 million worth of marketing equivalent acquisition cost signups for a job alert. And why I wanted to talk about this was just that, like, there's so much that goes into what makes it expensive or not expensive to write code. In that case, we didn't have appropriate unit tests, and the teams that were relied on us to produce things that worked. And they were heavily reliant on manual QA and didn't have any automated tests in their product either. And so that one line of code, like I said, was able to cost us about $2 million. Not the end of the world, obviously, but not a number that I like to think about too much either. But that's what I want to talk about, is that, like, every line of code that you or don't write comes with a cost. And at Swarmia, we talk about this in terms of this concept of engineering effectiveness, that we want to make sure that developers are working efficiently on the tasks in front of them. They aren't getting stuck, that they aren't waiting hours for this or that, or they aren't wrapped up in dependencies with other teams. So we want to make sure that developers on a team can be productive and like ship predictably and in a reasonable amount of time. We also want to make sure that the developers are in their experience. We can talk about developer experience. We want to make sure that developers aren't that basically, like, work isn't any harder than the task in front of them. They shouldn't have to be fighting with their development environment. They shouldn't have to be fighting with flaky tests. They shouldn't have to be, fighting with no tests at all, or a build that takes 6 hours. We want to make sure, like, the concept of developer experience is making sure that when an engineer goes to do something, it is no harder than the actual task in front of them. If I have to change the language on a button, that should be a change that I can make and get into production in minutes. But often, in even modern organizations, that's not the case. And then the last thing that we talk about at Swarmia is business outcomes. And that's why I really want to talk about this expensive line of code, because one of the most expensive lines of code you could write is one that the business didn't need. one that provided actually no value to the business. Your developer might have had a great experience writing it. Your developer might have been very productive and predictable in delivering it, but it could have been not the thing that the business actually needs. And so when we think about this whole productivity, effectiveness, like there's so many words that we can use. When we think about the space, we think about all three of those things, how it doesn't matter. You can be fast. You can make your engineers be fast and burn them out. You can make your engineers be fast and not burn them out, but they're actually working on the wrong thing. Or in the ideal world, they're working efficiently. They're working, they're having a positive non-burnout experience, and they're delivering the thing that the business needs. So let's see. Yeah, I want to talk about 6 ways that you, again, as an engineering leader, you specifically can improve productivity within your organization. And I bring it down into these kind of concepts: prioritization, interruptions, work in progress limits, outcomes versus outputs, investment balance, and organizational design. So we're going to walk through each of these and just talk about how, again, as a leader, you have a lot of control, or a lot of control. You have a lot of influence over how these things go. So let's start with thoughtful prioritization. And this is the idea that changing priorities has a cost. So let's say that you were really, here's a story. At Stripe, we really invested a ton for months and months and months on India data locality because we wanted to be able to have a stronger presence in India. And we worked on that for months and months and months. And then one day somebody decided that we weren't going to do that anymore. And that change in priority led to serious morale impact, led to debt that was accrued that wasn't going to get erased just because the project wasn't going on anymore. Definitely led to a ton of wasted work where people who had done work that didn't need to be done. And the switch from I'm working on data locality to I'm working on something else has a huge tax on the productivity and predictability of an engineering team. And so this in startups, I mean, I know it's like Swarmia is still, I think we just turned 5. Swarmia is still a pretty young company, and we don't always have consistent priorities from month to month. Sometimes things do change, but I think the key thing here is recognizing that change does have a cost. Sometimes it's going to be unavoidable. Maybe it was a good decision for us to stop working on data locality at Stripe, but it's important for you as leaders to recognize that kind of change doesn't happen for free. And it does impact both business outcomes, developer experience, and potentially even productivity. So again, I understand that priority changes, you shouldn't stick with the wrong priorities, obviously, and recognizing that there's a lot of weight that priorities carry, that when you change them, there is going to be a real impact to the near-term ability for the affected teams to deliver, and possibly a long-term impact on, like I said, the morale of the team. So this is, again, one way that we often see productivity going wrong is when leaders don't understand or don't recognize that these sorts of changes have a cost. So none of you're going to find, like in this talk, none of the solutions are surprising. They're just hard. It's really easy to say, have a cross-functional review process and document your reasoning. I think these things are really important, not in a heavyweight way where it takes, a month to change priorities, but having processes in place that at least help you make sure that you're making this costly decision for good reasons, and that you're recognizing and kind of calculating the impact of the decision when you're making it. Let's talk next about interruptions. This is one of my favorites. I am actually on vacation right now, accidentally, except for this presentation. So I'm wandering around with a couple of friends of mine in Barcelona talking. We've talked a lot today about interruptions, like how they're a part of life. Again, we can't always predict what's going to happen. We can't always predict what we should be working on tomorrow. But interruptions are one of my favorite things to talk about with leaders, because they can come both in like intended and unintended ways. So it's important to remember that when you interrupt someone, there is a study, there's some people disagree like exactly about what the number is and the methodology or whatever, but I think we also know as people that if you interrupt me in the middle of this, if like one of my coworkers is like, hey, Rebecca, can you go write a blog post right now? I'm definitely not going to come back to this conversation very quickly. And I'm going to have to reorient myself to the context of the conversation that we were having. So when the impact of interruptions of, hey, can you, those sorts of interruptions can be pretty profound on an engineer. And often you'll see engineers having this, especially more senior engineers, can be really a target of interruptions. And so again, as senior leaders, recognizing that interruptions are, again, have a cost. Doesn't mean you don't ever do them, but it does mean you need to recognize that when you do them, there's going to be a cost associated. And there's lots of kinds of interruptions. You know, there's the, hey, quick question interruption. There's the, I wonder if we could, or wouldn't it be neat if, where you say, as a senior leader, say something that just occurred to you kind of casually and you don't intend for anyone to go do any work based on that. But I've definitely seen it happen where people do then go spend time on that idea that you had and that you shared. And so that's a great example of the need to, you know, really recognize the often unwanted power that your words can have. Again, as a senior leader, you may need to kind of watch how you talk about things that so that you don't accidentally lead people to take on work that you didn't want them to, right? And to stop doing work that they were doing in order to do this work that they thought you wanted them to do instead. And then there's cultural kind of signals that lead to interruptions. The late night emails, the direct messages on a Saturday, that kind of thing can, these are cultural things that, again, as a leader, you want to recognize the impact that they're having. I'm not saying don't message people on the weekend or send emails at midnight. I've certainly done it too, but I definitely haven't necessarily recognized the way that causes people. I recognize the way that causes people to be like, oh, Rebecca wants this. I didn't realize the kind of interruptive power of that and how that can, again, lead to wasted work and lead to frustration among engineers. So there's and again, this is another one where like, these are really easy to list, but they can be really challenging to implement. But number one, like async by default, it's okay not to respond to the message that I just sent, and setting that as an expectation. That I expect that if you send me a message on Slack or Teams or whatever, I expect you to get back to me today, let's say, but I don't expect you to get back to me now. And setting those clear expectations again across the engineering organization that you can have SLOs around like, in engineering, we expect that you're checking Slack at least twice a day. And that any message that I send to you before 2, you will see and respond to by the end of the day. But giving people permission to not be interrupted is a pretty huge thing that you can do as leaders. Protected focus time is another one. Again, we talked about cultural expectations and careful language and cultural SLOs around response time. I've seen that be actually really effective as far as, again, giving people permission to not be interrupted, giving people permission to finish what they're working on before they raise their head to see what else is needed from them. Because one of the biggest drivers of negative productivity or productivity challenges is that not finishing what you started. If you can't consistently finish what you start, then you're going to leave wasted work on the table, and it's going to be more costly for you to come back to that work because you're going to have to do the context switching to get there. So if there was one thing that I could convince, that's why I have all 6 of these things. But I think this is a really one of the more important ones. I think work in progress limits is the most important one, but this is one of the more important ones that if you can stop that culture of interruption, then you help people finish what they start. And when people finish what they start, delivery is more efficient and more predictable. So at Stripe, we had we had the CEO is Patrick Collison, and he is wonderful and very brilliant, but also was often not recognizing the weight of his words. And so there was a moment where he realized that this deck that he was asking to be produced every 2 weeks for leadership review, one day he learned that that deck was costing hundreds of person hours to produce every 2 weeks. And he'd say, he would also be like, I want to know why this number moved this way. And suddenly, like, a team would drop everything they were doing to try and understand why that number moved that way. And it was there were so many examples of, he was doing it in good faith. He was doing it for good reasons. He really wasn't recognizing the impact of those asks. And I think that was something he had to kind of work on as a growing leader, as well, was recognizing that he can't just say things on a whim, and that when he asks a question, if he doesn't assign some value to the speed of the answer, that it can kind of drop everything situation, and that's probably not what you want. So making sure that when you are it's real, like, it's a real thing. As a leader, you're going to have moments where you need to interrupt people, but again, recognizing that has a real cost. And probably one of the biggest costs is the potential for wasted work, where you interrupt somebody, they have to work on something new for 2 days, and then in those 2 days, suddenly it doesn't seem so important to be working on that old thing anymore, or now there's an incident that has to get dealt with. So the more that you pause work in progress, the more likely it is that work doesn't get finished, or that it gets finished very unpredictably. This one's my favorite, because I think this one, so when I'm talking to teams about productivity, there's some really, like, the list of things that I tell them to do is very, very simple. But doing it is very, very hard. And this is one of the ones I think is particularly hard for a team to execute on, unless they have leadership support. For a team to be able to say, we have 4 people on this team, that means we will never be working on more than 3 things at once. Period. The end. That's very hard for a line manager to say to the chief product officer, perhaps, but that's where you, again, as senior leaders, come in and help your less technical stakeholders, perhaps, understand that, truly this is math, this is Q math, this is Little's law, that if you try and work on too many things at once, nothing will get done. You imagine that you had a grocery store checkout, where there's like 5 aisles and you choose which aisle you get into, but then the person is trying to, like, process everybody's groceries all at once instead of processing them one at a time. And that also the efficiency changes if you have somebody with 10 items versus somebody with 100, the efficiency changes. So really, like, making sure that you're working on a reasonably small number of things at once, and that you aren't getting distracted by other things that other people want. This is the #1 way to increase the throughput of a team, is to reduce how much it's working on at any given time. And again, that you can tell a line manager that all day, but they may not have the political capital or the skills or whatever to be able to push back against someone who's trying to push them to disregard these limits. So yeah, like, if you take a team of 5 developers and that team tends to work on 8 to 10 things at a time, that's bad. If you reduce their work in progress to 3 to 4 items, you can expect to see a double-digit percentage improvements in delivery speed, and fewer incidents, and higher predictability. Is the single most powerful thing that you can do to increase the throughput and predictability of your engineering teams, is to reduce the number of things that you're asking them to work on at once. Again, feel free to ask questions. I'm not watching the Q&A, but Martin, you can chime in if anyone is asking questions. Martin, you have a question. There you go.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask, you can manage basically what I think what you're getting at is how much are you putting on the developers? But I think from my experience, it's also important to protect them from themselves in some ways. And I would think that's a different cup of tea. How do you have any practical advice? What works best, like in your experience? Maybe just for everyone, because I think like there is always these like people that are very valuable in like the team because they are just so ambitious, but sometimes a lot of times
do
they
this themselves,
overshoot.
right?
Yeah, and
Yeah. So I really do, the more that I've learned about this over the years, and I've been kind of casually interested in productivity since I went to school like 30 years ago. But as I've been learning more and more about it over the last couple of years, I think the thing that you need to do with everyone, the line managers, the ICs, everyone, is explain to them that this isn't an opinion. This isn't like an idea that you had. This isn't like how Uber does it or how Google does it, and therefore we should do it. This is actually math. It's math that they may have even learned in CS school, like getting their CS degree. They learned about queues and processing work from queues. And I think that the challenge with everyone, like we are all high achievers. We've like been perhaps treated as like, smart people most of our lives. And so it's very easy for us or an IC to tell themselves that I'm different. I can handle 4 things at once. I have been that person who's like, I can, like, well, I don't know about this whole multitasking thing they say is bad. Like, I got this. No, I didn't got this. So I think some of it is just educating people that there is like pretty well established math in the form of Little's law around how the processing of items in a queue works. And if you don't follow that, then you're competing with math. Philippe has a question. Do you mean increase speed but maintain throughput? Like making so I think what it means is in terms of it's not about, I don't like to talk about speed so much as I'd like to talk about like you're going to get more things done and you're going to get them done more predictably. That doesn't mean faster necessarily, but like you will start, if you've ever learned about Kanban, one of the concepts of Kanban is that as you get the system up and running, you start to have about 80% confidence that a ticket that enters this stage will enter this other stage within a certain number of days. And that helps with planning. That helps with keeping people, not constantly breathing down your neck about is it done yet, is it done yet? So I think when you limit this work in progress, it is, it's not about, oh, you can go faster so much as it's about it is about that predictability and that kind of smooth throughput rather than the more spiky throughput that you're going to see if you were dealing with higher work in progress. And I think, yeah, getting blocked that's another topic that we're going to talk about actually in a minute, as far as organizational design, because yes, getting blocked is the worst thing that can happen here because it violates this rule. If you suddenly like shut down one of the lines of checkout at the grocery store while people are in line, then you're going to have some pretty bad outcomes. And those people are going to have to figure out how to redistribute themselves and all of that. Maybe you have one person who is in the middle of checking out and you've suddenly kicked them out of the line. So yeah, it's more about this work in progress limit in my mind is more about like putting all the pieces in place so that you can work on the right next thing and focus all of your energy on that right next thing. The question about delivery speed, I'm kind of referring to cycle time here and deployment frequency. So cycle time is one of the DORA metrics, if you're familiar with those. If not, DevOps Research Assessment is a group that every year kind of analyzes how software is getting built and how work moves through software development systems. And so their change lead time is, or I'm sorry, their cycle time is basically from the time you start to the time it's in production. How long does it take? And you can have cycle times of 50 days, or you can have cycle times of 5 minutes. Like both of those exist in the world, and you want to move your world to cycle times of minutes or hours instead of days or weeks. So it's really just like once I start, how long am I working on it until it's done and in production? Is kind of how I think about delivery speed. There's another DORA metric is deployment frequency. That's a little bit different because deployment frequency is going to be a function of your build system, and there may be a function of dependencies, or maybe there's a build train or something like that. So when I talk about delivery speed, it really is like from I started it, I finished it, how much time went by. So does that help you, Philippe? Yes, excellent. Any other questions about that part? Because I think this is one of the, like I said, the single most powerful thing you can do as a leader is to help your teams limit their work in progress. And it was a great point that you may also need to help your team members limit their work in progress. I think that's a great call out. But yeah, any other questions on this one before I move on to outcomes versus outputs? I'm going to keep going, but feel free to, I love interrupting questions. They're not interruptions at all. They're fun. We have good talks. This one's a little bit squishier. Work in progress limits is pretty straightforward. How many things are you working on at once? And if it's too many, make it less. Outcomes versus outputs is more of a kind of cultural shift in how you think about your engineering organization. And so let's look at these 3 statements, and I'm curious, like, can anyone kind of see the difference between these three ways that you could ask a team to do something? You could say, we need to reduce API response times by 50%, we need to implement a caching layer, or we need to get API response times under 200 milliseconds at P95 in order to win this class of customers. What do you see as the differences between these statements? You can type or talk, no warnings. Yes, 3 is an actual observation from the user's perspective. It definitely centers the user. What's bad about the second one? Ooh, I like both of those. Tells the solution and you can't measure it. Yes, exactly. And so this is kind of an illustration of, there's three levels here, obviously. One is like implement a caching layer. When it's done, close the ticket. That is a very output-focused way of thinking about assigning work to a team, where you have decided for them how to do the thing, and you've disconnected them entirely from any sort of why or any sort of understanding of what the impact on the business will be if they do this thing. And again, I was talking to a friend of mine, on vacation, a friend of mine is with me who works at Uber, and we were talking about how, how she thinks they actually do this pretty well. And I was like, I hear you. Like, yes, there are lots of companies that do this well. But also about a year ago, I was at a conference and met a woman who was a senior software engineer. I don't remember the company, but it was a company with several hundred engineers at least. Senior software engineer, and I asked her how she understood the impact of her work, like how she understood like whether her work mattered. And it was fascinating to see this was not a question she had really thought about before, because it wasn't part of the culture of how they work. How they work at that company is you get a ticket and you do it, and then you get another ticket and you do that. And so I have seen at these more mature and more established and more name-droppy companies that yes, a lot of these practices are in place, and if you're in that world, great. But I've also seen plenty of organizations that are maybe less mature or a less well-known brand, where engineers really are operating as workers, as simply like people who need to flip the dial or flip the switch or turn the dial or feed the coal into the machine to keep the train running. And this again is it can be really hard to do this because you just need a caching layer. But this can be choosing to focus on those outcomes of like what will be good when you're done, gives the teams a lot more agency to determine the solution and to understand how it's impacting the customer. Whereas if you simply focus on the output of like what needs to be done in order to call this done, it'll get done, but it probably won't get done with any coherence with regard to the next thing that the person works on. It probably won't be done it may not be done in a way that actually solves the customer problem, because that caching layer gets the API response times down to 300 milliseconds to P95. And you haven't actually accomplished anything. So really focusing your engineering teams on the value that you want to provide to the customer, and getting them to be thinking about that rather than thinking, let them figure out what the individual execution steps are, but make sure that you're clear on what needs to be true in order for this to be done, rather than you need to implement a caching layer. And again, yeah, outcome-based planning really focuses teams. Instead of focusing on like, I got to get 6 tickets done this week, it focuses teams on, I need to get this thing done so that we can land, Docker as our customer in a month or something like that. So I think that outcome focus can be really energizing, and the output focus can be really kind of disempowering, and is likely over time to lead to productivity challenges and quality challenges as well, which are kind of two sides of the same coin. Next thing I want to talk about, and this is going to be the only screenshot of Swarmia in this presentation, but is thinking about where your engineering time is going, and understanding whether it's going to the places that it needs to be going. So in Swarmia, we have this pretty cool tool called investment balance, and it lets us look at how teams are spending their time. So this is an example of, this is like a whole company view of how engineering is spending its time at a made-up company, at a make-believe company. And you can see here that in this case, the engineers at the make-believe company are spending a lot of time on keeping the lights on. Like sometimes approaching 50% of their work is keeping the lights on. They're working on new things, they're working on productivity, they're working on improving things, but so much of their time is going to keeping the lights on. That could be in the form of incidents, it could be in the form of library upgrades, it could be in the form of like, we have to restart this server every 3 days, or whatever it might be. And when I look at this graph, I also know that product probably isn't very happy with this team. Product probably wishes this team was doing more product work. But in a scenario like this, where you see that there's so much time going to keeping the lights on, and really far less than half of the team's time is going to actual development of customer value, you kind of have two choices. I mean, you have the third choice of do nothing and see how it works out. But if you want to improve the situation, you kind of have two choices. And one is to increase your investment in productivity and KTLO at the near-term expense of product work, because this is those bars have to add up to 100. They can't add up to 110 or 120. They add up to like, this is all the time that we have. So you can either invest in that keeping the lights on, in paying down whatever is causing that excessive keeping the lights on work. That could be, like I said, tech debt, that could be so many things. So you could work on paying that down, but you're going to need to get product on board with that idea, get them on board with the idea that like, look, right now, all of this KTLO means that we cannot deliver predictably for you right now. And if you ever want us to be able to deliver predictably, we are going to need to reduce some of the time that that we're spending on product work so that we can get to a better place. Question, I'll get to this question in just a second. The other option, of course, is to spend more money. Increase the size of your engineering workforce so that there are enough people to work on keeping the lights on, and enough people to work on maintaining the current system while building new things. Neither of these are really, this whole presentation is about like hard things that I'm asking you to do as engineering leaders, because this, again, the math here is very obvious. These are your two choices, but as a leader, these are your two choices. You're going to need to have a conversation with product saying, we can't actually do as much as you want us to be doing right now, or else the house of cards is going to collapse. Or you need to have a conversation with your CFO saying, I don't have enough engineers to work on the things that are going to make this a long-term sustainable venture. And so I need more money to go hire more engineers. And this is one of the reasons that I think it's really valuable that investment balances in Swarmia is your ideal goal is to never get into this situation in the first place, right? You want to be paying attention to this in an ongoing way so that when you see that KTLO is creeping up to like above 30%, thank you, Daniel, for coming. If you see that KTLO is creeping up to 30%, that's the time to take an action, because it's much harder to take an action when you're in this sort of situation where teams are going to be feeling like they're kind of constantly drowning by trying to keep the lights on and keep product happy. And that's exactly where you get into hero engineers wanting to be able to do both things at once. I'm going to work on that incident, and then I'm going to work this weekend to ship that feature. I've seen it, you've probably seen it too. That's the kind of scenario that you get into when you allow keeping the lights on work to get out of hand like this. So my first recommendation is don't. But if you do, you actually have a really hard choice that you need to make. And you need to communicate that to product in a way that helps product understand that this is, it's an eat your vegetables thing. It's good for you in the long run. We've got a question from Sebastian about what's a unit you commonly use to measure the share of investment. Yeah, so we are at Swarmia, we're kind of evolving how we come up with these percentages. The very naive way is like how many tickets. Eventually, all tickets are the same size. That's like the law of large numbers. Like eventually, all tickets are the same size, and so we. Our first pass at this in Swarmia was to just look at, how many tickets are getting done of this type of work versus this type of work versus this type of work. We're bringing more intelligence to that and looking more closely at like how much time was actually spent on each of those issues that will be able to make a clearer statement of truly like you had 4 engineers working on this initiative for 4 months. Is that what you meant to do or not? So. But yeah, so Sebastian, I hope that answers your question. That our first pass on this was kind of pretty basic, but we're now getting into looking at this with more nuance. And Philippe, you asked the question of how do you decide 30 is the danger threshold? Totally depends on the company size, right? If you don't have product market fit, so I think I have a slide about this in a sec. If you don't have product market fit, then you probably shouldn't be spending that much time on KTLO. Like it's okay to let that get out of hand. Once you have product market fit and you're looking to scale the organization, then I get really nervous about 30% because you're about to add a whole lot more like chaos to your engineering world. There's gonna be a lot of new people, a lot of new things getting built and all of that. And if that KTLO was already hovering in the 30s, you're going to run into challenges trying to grow your organization. I think that's a really typical place for organizations to end up, which is why I think it's important to look at from the early days. And love the questions. Get right back to them in a second. I think it's also, I want to also point out that investing in productivity early on is also valuable. We had a conversation the CEO of Swarmia and I recorded a conversation last week on LinkedIn Live about how when Swarmia was getting started, we took the time to set up automated testing, to set up a good CI/CD system. It wasn't a lot of time, it was just a little time, but once that existed, we didn't have to build it later. And so even early, looking for opportunities to improve productivity, I think it's really very sensible. Early looking for, our build takes 5 minutes to run and it should take 3. Probably not your top priority. But when you have 1,000 developers and the build takes 50 minutes and should probably take 3, then that's a pretty important thing to be working on. So I think it definitely depends on the stage of the company, really. And certainly I can imagine industry could matter too, but the thing that in my mind matters the most is where are you on that product market fit versus scale up versus steady state. But you never, you want to keep an eye on this number to make sure that it's not starting to dominate where your engineers are spending their time. And most engineers will tell you, like, this isn't optional work. Some of it might be optional. Maybe you can push back, like, do we really need to be on node 19 or whatever it is now? So, not all, you could argue that not all KTLO needs to be done, but most KTLO needs to be done in order to preserve kind of the long-term stability of a code base. I'm loving the questions. Let's see. Yeah, there's definitely, Sebastian, there's a reason that we're building in the time-based portion. It's precisely because it's going to be more accurate than the number of tickets, especially, when you get to a number of tickets that is like thousands per year, then we can play the law of large numbers game and just kind of say all of these are approximately equivalent in the end. At a more realistic, at a smaller organization, the law of large numbers probably isn't going to come into play, and we're going like the FTE or the looking at time spent is going to be far more reliable. So that's why we are working on that. Let's see. There was another question. Significant differences, overhead. So on the tracking time, please don't make your developers track time. Please buy or build a system that does it for them. There's nothing where developers have to, in Swarmia, where developers have to be like, I spent 2 hours on this ticket. We look at the commits that like all the activities happening around that ticket and use that to kind of derive how much time was spent. And as far as meetings, we're Swarmia front. So at Stripe, we did a lot of work around focus time and on meetings. It was fascinating because we set out to people were telling us that they were in way too many meetings and like we need to cut back on meetings. We need to have more no meeting days and all this stuff. We like pulled everybody's Google Calendar data and did some in-depth analysis of it and found that actually that problem mostly tended to affect the more senior you were, the more likely that was a problem. And if you weren't particularly senior, it really wasn't a problem worth the business spending money to fix because people actually did have large chunks of uninterrupted time. So anyway, that's something we're getting into at Swarmia hopefully soon, is bringing calendar data into this too, to understand how that kind of time is getting spent. And especially again on the new stuff versus improving stuff, this framework is actually something that we borrowed from a former VP of engineering at Dropbox, whose name is escaping me. And he kind of laid this out. And I think that part of separating the new things and improving things is that product should be thinking too about how they want to be spending their engineering time. The product could be thinking about spending it all on building new things. And you're like, but we've got 50 complaints about how that thing works. So I think it's just recognizing that those are different kinds of work, and you, depending on the stage of your company and the stage of your product, you may want to be making different choices. We're certainly doing that at Swarmia right now, where we built a bunch of new stuff over the last year, and now we're kind of switching our focus to invest a lot more in improving the things that we've built. So this is just a tool to make that a more conscious choice. The last thing I want to talk about is that organizational design plays a huge part in all of this as well. So we're going back. We were talking earlier about dependencies and getting blocked by something. And this is where organizational design becomes really, really important, and architecture becomes important. You want to be always moving toward a place where a team can't be blocked most of the time, 80% of the time, they have the capacity within the team to finish the work. And if that's not true, you need to look at it. Is your team correctly skilled? You need to look at, are the boundaries around teams in the right place? If these two teams always have to work with each other to get something done, you may want to combine them into one team, even though it might be like a little bit too big of a team. You may still want to combine them into one team so that there's no external dependencies. There's no like fighting over prioritization. And so again, really easy to say, or really hard to do, but as you are adding teams or as you're splitting your first teams, thinking about like what needs to be true in order for this team to be able to operate mostly autonomously. You're never going to get it 100% right, but the classic pattern is a front end and a back end team. I worked on the front end team with the back end team, and that's a nightmare because you're constantly like, both teams are constantly having to make prioritization decisions, either in sync or not in sync, and then living with the consequences of that. But the reality was that on that team, we couldn't do anything without the back end team participating with us as well. So happy to talk. We're running out of time here, so I'm not going to talk a bunch about organizational structure, but it's a good reminder that organizational structure has a ton of impact on productivity as well. And so being intentional about structuring teams so that they are truly cross-functional, so that they have all the skills on the team to do the work, and then structuring the code base so that that team can accomplish most of its work without help. Again, really, really impactful on really hard to do, really impactful on productivity if you can pull it off. So I want to leave you with just these. We don't have to talk about them because we're out of time. I wanted to leave you with these two questions. What is your biggest productivity challenge at an organizational or cultural level, and what's stopping you from fixing it? And if you'd like to I love talking to people about this stuff. If you want to have a follow-up chat, just drop me a note, drop me an email, and I'm happy to chat about this stuff in more detail. And then I've got one more from, or Martin, do you want to go, or do you want me? I was going to answer Philippe's question here.
Okay.
Okay. So Philippe has team-owned outcomes at medium time horizon, but individual works best with outputs at short time horizon. It's great. I think it's a great question, and I think that some of it goes to seniority, right? Like, if I'm getting a college grad, then yeah, I'm going to be pretty focused on the output. But I want to make sure that college grad, new grad, at least has some exposure to the why of what we're doing it. If we were just kind of constantly handing them tasks, we're not teaching them the skills of being a good product developer. But yes, there are certainly circumstances where it's that we need to upgrade, this library. It is a known task. And that's okay. I'm not saying, but you may even in that case want to have some sort of like, why do we need to upgrade the library? How often do we upgrade library? Why are the upgrade libraries important? And so having some sort of conversation around like, even when the assignment is a task, having at least some conversation around the why of that task.
Okay, so people are leaving already.
Yes.
And I think we can wrap it up. So
yes.
We are having everyone leave on time. Thank you, Rebecca, for the great talk. I think it was really cool. We can do this. So that's coming. Okay, so yeah, thank you. I have one more question. Maybe if someone else, we can do 2 questions maybe before we end it straight at 6. Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I would go You can just raise your hands, go. You can write it in chat any way you want. Okay, otherwise, I will go. So my question is, I think the best products I've ever used were basically built for people to use yourself, right? So at Swarmia, how much are you how much are you getting new features that are you developing for Swarmia? And what was maybe just like a question attached to that? What was the biggest mistake you've done where you're like, oh, that's a cool feature, and then because you used it yourself, maybe, and then it turned out to be not that great of a feature because you thought it would be solving some problem that it actually did.
I have a story that's kind of the opposite of that, but I think is equally interesting. So at Swarmia, we are very Kanban-y. We do not do sprints. We do not do story points. We don't do any of the traditional Scrum stuff. That's not to say that Scrum stuff is bad, but we don't do it. It's great training wheels for a team that maybe has never thought about any of this stuff. So again, nothing against Scrum, but I think one of the mistakes that we made at Scrum was the opposite of what you said, where it's like, well, we don't do sprints, so we're not going to build sprints. We don't do sprints, and we kind of have a yucky feeling about sprints. So it just kept being a thing that we didn't do. Because we didn't use it, we didn't need it. And we have since revisited that decision, but I think it's one of the more interesting decisions where we kind of let our own ways of working get in the way, because Swarmia really, we set out to be agnostic about exactly what your processes are and like what process you use, and if different teams use different processes. We try to be really agnostic about that, and we had no view of sprints in the product. So like I said, that has changed now, and I think we all kind of recognize that was a maybe an error of emotion more than anything.
Okay, there was one other question maybe, but we are already out of time. But I'm pretty sure Rebecca is happy to maybe get in touch and then follow up on that.
Yes.
So thank you everyone for coming. I don't want to keep you any longer. Yes, maybe you can stay if you want with Rebecca. I'm not sure. And thanks everyone. I will end this main session here now. But if anyone wants to stay on with us, maybe for 1 or 2 more minutes and ask like my final question, that's fine.
Yeah, I can stick around for a couple minutes, but thank you everyone.
So, thank you everyone.
George, yes, you had the question about AI and developer coworkers. I have a lot of a lot of feelings about this. I don't have a sort of blessed Swarmia blessed answer to this, but I think like it's a boring answer, but if you're trying to evaluate the impact of these things, of AI tools, then you want to look at your DORA metrics, because DORA metrics are really great at highlighting the tension between speed and quality. Now, it's not necessarily like investing in automated testing is investment in quality that is also an investment in speed, right? So if you're using AI to help you write more automated tests, is that having an impact on quality? Are you having fewer incidents because you're using AI? DORA should really help you be able to see that. Is your cycle time decreasing because you have AI? What I definitely like GitHub's putting out lots of like, yay, Copilot stuff, but I have also heard from engineering leaders that like, yeah, we went faster, but like that wasn't actually such a great thing in the end, to go faster, because it's not just about speed. So I think like DORA is a great starting point for pretty much all evaluation of engineering processes. It's not where you stop, but it's a great thermometer for like, we gave you this medicine. Did your fever go down? Doesn't tell you why you had the fever, but like you took some Advil, or I'm sorry, paracetamol, I guess is what I need to say over here. You took some paracetamol and your fever went down. We still don't know why, but like that's an interesting fact, right? So that's how I kind of approach all of these. Like, is X better than try it and see, run an experiment with a team or two and see what happens to their metrics. Those of you left, and there's very few of you, for those of you left, seriously, feel free to contact me at these any of these places. I'm on vacation for the next week, so I may not get right back to you, but I will definitely get back to you and would love to continue these conversations.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
And thank you, Rebecca.